The Clear Signal with Steve Visscher is produced in the first instance as a radio show, and it's aired on stations around Australia. Due to music licensing restrictions, copyright-protected music tracks in this podcast edition have either been replaced with royalty-free alternatives or removed entirely.
The Clear Signal with Steve Visscher.
Well, yep, another week's rolled around and, well, look, here we are. Welcome, folks. Great to have you with us here again on The Clear Signal. Looking forward to a great hour ahead. I've got a couple of wonderful guests once again and, some really interesting topics to have a look at. I'm pretty sure of that. We know if it's one thing that none of us can escape right now, it seems, it's the cost of everything you put in your shopping basket each week. We hear a lot of news and commentary about labour shortages and international factors and still even pandemic issues, and they all seem to be working together to have pushed all our prices sky high, or at least, well, that's what everybody tells us. But I wonder, does anybody really stop and consider what that really means when people are saying all of that? Food manufacturing, of course, is not only vital for the obvious reasons that it makes sure that we're all fed and we're all healthy, but it's an incredibly large part of the national economy and it's a really large employer. I thought we might dig a little deeper into some of these issues this week, and I'll be joined in this first half hour by the CEO of the Australian Food and Grocery Council, Tanya Barden. Tanya's waiting on the line and she'll join us in just a few moments. Ahead also this week, we're going to be joined by one of the veterans of Australian radio, Gary Mack. Now, Gary's played a really significant role, not only in the on-air side of radio, in a career that spans many decades, in fact, right back to the 1960s, so he's been in it a long time. But he's also established himself many years ago as a mentor for endless numbers of radio hopefuls and voiceover artists across the years. And, I might tell you, I'm one of those. And in fact, Gary actually set up an industry-leading radio school many years ago in Melbourne. Now, he doesn't own that school these days, but boy, there's a lot of people you hear on radio these days that Gary's played some sort of a hand in having a role in teaching them, the craft of radio and the craft of voiceovers. It's actually a really interesting craft to learn if you like that sort of stuff. Now, Gary's a bit of a raconteur, and I'm sure he'll have a story or three to tell us. There's no doubt about that. So I'm really looking forward to catching up with Gary. He's a really great guy. That's in the second half hour. But first up, as I mentioned, we're going to take a look at some of the issues in and around our food manufacturing sector and how it all works. Tanya Barden heads up the Australian Food and Grocery Council. It's a major industry group in this sector. She joins us on the line now. Tanya, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be with you.
I'm really looking forward to talking a bit today about the food and grocery industry because I think obviously it's top of mind for everybody every time they go to the supermarket. I think every industry too needs a good lobby group, and I guess that's what your group does.
It's one of the many things that we do. So the Australian Food and Grocery Council has been around for 30 years next year. We were formed by a small number of large food manufacturers, and we've grown since that time to represent multinational companies that have operations in Australia, big Australian-owned companies, right down to smaller Australian-owned businesses. And they are across food, beverages and non-food grocery products. So pretty much anything that is sold in the supermarket are the sorts of organisations that we represent. And you're right, we do advocacy, not only to government at both a state and a federal level on a whole range of different policy issues, but we also do advocacy to represent the industry's interests on retail trading relations. So, for example, issues to do with dealing with the major supermarkets. And in addition to advocacy, we're also providing insights and information to our members around some of the trends that are happening, some of the regulatory pressures happening domestically and globally. And then lastly, we also run events and provide a forum for members to collectively solve problems. So something like soft plastics is an issue the industry wanted to solve. And so we've got together with the major manufacturers and put together an industry-led solution. So advocacy is one part, information and insights, collective action, as well as events and webinars and so on for our members.
And it's really interesting there that you say you're looking at both sides of the equation there, if you like. You've got the retail side with the big, the big supermarkets and smaller businesses as well, but also you've got the input side of that, the manufacturers. So how is the relationship oftentimes between those two sides of the equation? Obviously, everyone needs to have a successful business and a viable business. I imagine, particularly in these times, that's very challenging on all sides of that that equation.
Yeah, and just to clarify again that we represent the manufacturers, the processors, the suppliers of food and grocery products, not the farmers and not the supermarket retailers. But you're right, that relationship between suppliers and retailers is a really important one, and it's a very multifaceted one. So it's not just as simple as a supplier making a packet of biscuits and wanting to just, get it listed nationally. There's a whole relationship that needs to sit around that to work collaboratively on a strategy that the retailer is trying to execute, as well as what's in the interests of the supplier. And then broader than that, looking at broader trends across the industry around how to make products more sustainable and healthy choices. So there are some aspects to the retailer-supplier relationship that can at times become challenging, and that often gets some media attention. But there's also a lot of other aspects where there's a really good degree of collaboration between the retailers and suppliers as well.
We've come out of a very challenging time in recent years. Of course, we talk a lot about COVID and supply chain issues. That you hear that term a lot, Tanya. A lot about supply chain issues, and that being a reason for pushing up the cost of groceries at the supermarket shelf. Can you explain, I guess, at a high level, what are those supply chain issues that people always talk about? How did COVID affect that?
Yeah, and I think, Steve, there's some really important context for your listeners before tackling that, which is that the decade before COVID came along, food and grocery inflation was very flat. There was hardly any inflation at a consumer pricing level. Most manufacturers hadn't taken price increases for a decade or so, and yet their input costs had been rising. So for the decade before COVID, we already had input costs rising at double the rate of wholesale prices, and the industry's profitability was going backwards. Capital investment was stagnating. So that was the context. And then along came COVID with a significant amount of disruption. So we had transport disruption from sea freight, where it was harder and longer to be able to get ingredients, inputs, packaging, and so on from overseas into Australia. You had a lot longer times and costs associated with warehousing product. There was also disruptions to domestic freight networks because of lack of availability of drivers through that COVID period, restrictions around movements around the country because of government-imposed restrictions on people movements. And then you had what was happening beyond COVID at a global level, so geopolitical tensions that were happening over in Europe and in the Middle East. That has also contributed to some increases in commodity prices, further exacerbated some of the global shipping type challenges as well. And then thirdly, there were weather events going on within Australia where we had some commodities going up as a result of drought, but then there was also some really strong flooding that was happening that was impacting not only the availability of some agricultural inputs, but also the distribution of product around the country. So most food and groceries is made in New South Wales and Victoria. There's a great big rail line over to Perth, and that was underwater for a significant amount of time. And so businesses were needing to reroute through Queensland, Northern Territory, or ship things around to WA at significantly extra cost. So basically, everything to do with the cost of manufacturing a food product, distributing it, getting it to a customer went up significantly in price. And we talked about shipping, we've talked about warehousing and transport and those sorts of costs, but commodities, packaging costs have gone up significantly, a whole raft of inputs. And then you've had the other elements like insurances and building costs and construction costs. So basically, huge amount of inflation's come through, and only a portion of that has been passed through to the retailers and to the consumers.
We're a few years down now from, I guess, that COVID era, and there's still a lot of those. I mean, one of the key points I think there is that we live in a global market, but are we starting to see any of those cost pressures abate, or is it still an issue? We see people talk a lot, everyone's hyper-focused on the inflation rate at the moment. How's that looking?
Some costs have come down. So global shipping has moderated, but it is still above where it was before COVID. Some commodity prices have come down, but then others have gone up significantly. So coffee and cocoa, for example, are several 100% above where they were even about 18 months ago. Now, that's a result of adverse weather events in some of the African regions where they're grown. Disease and pests has impacted on some other crops. So some things have come down, but are still above kind of the average over the last decade. Other things have gone up. So we've seen increases in costs associated with labour and big increases around energy. So we're not out of the woods as a sector.
Yes, energy is top of mind. In fact, last week's show I was speaking to Dr. Adi Patterson, an expert on that area of energy production, and I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge for many, many years as we transition to different forms of technology.
Can I just build on that, Steve, which is if you think about your home kitchen and as you move out of having a gas-fired cooktop to over time electrification, you'll need to replace that oven. Think about that on scale for food and grocery manufacturers. So bread that's made in high efficiency, high performance ovens that are powered by gas will need to be replaced. So it's not just about changing the energy source, it's actually about significant investments in capital equipment needed as we go through this net zero transition.
Well, that's a really interesting thing. Yeah, funny you mentioned bread because I live not far from the Tip Top factory, actually, Tanya, and I could tell you, it would be a sad day if that wonderful smell every morning of fresh baked bread. There's a big tick for Tip Top anyway. But
I was just there yesterday.
Hey, well, the interesting side of that, of course, is the regulatory environment. I suppose we talk about transitioning to electrification. I know that's a very big topic here in Victoria at the moment, for example. Do we think that politicians, when they come out with these policies, do they understand some of the flow-on cost impacts of this, and do you think they've got strategies to cope with it?
I'd say that there is an appetite within Parliament at the moment to ensure Australia has a strong manufacturing base, but we don't have the right policies that are delivering that. So we've got, as I say, high industrial relations costs, high energy costs. These are things that make businesses globally uncompetitive. And the risk is when their assets get to the end of life, companies have to make a decision. Are they going to invest in Australia? Are they going to keep jobs in Australia? Or are they going to move their manufacturing offshore to other markets that are lower cost to operate, as well as provide significant financial incentives to set up there? So we've been advocating to government for a long time for capital investment incentives. So to support the industry to go through a net zero transition, to support the establishment of a circular economy for packaging and all the capital equipment changes needed for that, as well as just to boost the competitiveness through more digital technologies, more automation that can help mitigate your costs. Because of those underlying profit pressures we talked about at the beginning, that does impact on the ability to be able to invest in Australia. And so we do need government incentives that will help businesses to make those investments, that will keep jobs and keep manufacturing and economic activity here in Australia. So we need better policies to help deliver that.
The clear signal.
You're listening to The Clear Signal. My very special guest this week is the CEO of the Australian Food and Grocery Council, Tanya Barden. Tanya, what is the value of the sector? I mean, it must be a huge amount of money that flows through that sector in the national economy every year.
Yeah, that's right. It's Australia's largest manufacturing sector. So the turnover of the industry is $163 billion. And that's product that is sold through supermarkets as well as through other channels like cafes and restaurants and hospitals, and also export. The sector employs 288,000 people, and about a third, actually closer to 40% of the industry is based in rural and regional areas. And we've only ever measured the direct impact of the sector. Now, just the other week, I was down in Shepparton, Northern Victoria, and that's a real powerhouse for food manufacturing and grocery manufacturing in that region. And
Sure
driving around there, you can see the dairy, you can see the apple orchard, you can see the processor of the milk and the processor of the fruit. But then you can see the local engineering firm, the local fitter and turner, the company that makes the big steel tanks. There's a whole separate economy and jobs that are really built on the back of manufacturing. So we need to recognise, yes, it's a big sector with $163 billion, but its actual effect on the Australian economy and regional economies is far greater.
Yeah, I think we saw that that was sort of writ large probably 10 years ago, and we started to lose the automotive industry, wasn't it? Where there was not only the big manufacturers, but there was a lot of secondary and tertiary industry around that just disappeared. And not only from an economic standpoint, if we lose industries, secondary industries like that, there's an economic impact, of course, but then there is the loss of the skill set. And I think that's something that needs to be talked about too.
That's right. That's right. And also what's unique about food and grocery is that these are products that people consume every single day. As a nation, we need to have a certain amount of sovereign capability in that, because we do live in a world of much more global disruption, geopolitical tensions, weather events. There's still a lot of global pressure, which means that we become at risk because our supply chains are very lengthy and very dependent on that global market. So unlike cars, you can't do without, production of food and grocery in Australia. So we do need to have those policies to make sure that we keep that strong base here.
Very true. Tanya, I wanted to touch on just on that. I suppose that kind of links in a way into the topic of food security. And one of the interesting things I find living in the part of Melbourne where I live kind of right on the fringe. I wonder about urban encroachment onto what was once farming land. I am seeing a lot of primary producers around the area where I live, and it's not only something that happens in my part of the world, but in a lot of major cities where they're now being turned into housing estates. Are those farmers relocating, do you find, or is that production just lost?
If you look at the dairy industry, we're seeing a massive loss of dairy farmers. They're moving out of the industry. Now, there's a whole range of factors that are impacting that in dairying. I do think land availability, it is one factor, because then rather than passing your farm on to your family, if you can sell it and make a better buck selling it to a property developer, then you might not continue that business as a family. That might be the end of it. I think that urban encroachment is also impacting on manufacturing though as well, because, Western Sydney, for example, there's a lot of manufacturing based out in that area, but there's also been a massive amount of urban infill and growth in property development. So you've got this competition. Now, some people say, why don't manufacturers just move more out into the regions? But to do that, you need to have stronger freight routes than we have at the moment. You need to have access to labour. And one of the biggest challenges for rural and regional areas is being able to get the labour to go and work in those areas.
And that really comes back down, I guess, to government policy, doesn't it? Because they need to, it's one thing to say, you can just move out, but they need to be able to create a regulatory, I guess, and a financial environment that makes that sort of move attractive.
Yeah, that's right. And it's about looking at those regional centres in terms of, have you got adequate housing? Have you got adequate education? Like all those services that people need wherever they're living, we need to strengthen those in the regions to make it somewhere that is appealing for people to go and work.
Now, we talked just briefly before on the idea of advances in technology in many areas. You talked about packaging in particular. One of the podcasts that my company produces talks a lot about packaging and a lot to do with packaging around food. And some people might yawn at that, but it's actually really interesting. There's so much really interesting tech that's going on. Yeah,
and I think packaging is something that is, it's really in the spotlight at the moment. There's a lot of kind of community and government expectation about making changes to packaging. And that's something as an industry we are up for, and we're making those changes. But we can't lose sight of the fact that packaging actually plays a really important role. First and foremost, it protects the quality and the safety of the products, and there's regulatory requirements that sit around those. But also it can help reduce the environmental impact of a packaging. If I think about something that's in a glass jar, for example, versus a PET plastic bottle, sometimes people will say, the glass is better for the environment, better than plastic, because there's all this kind of fear around plastic. Now, plastic becomes a problem when it leaches out of a system and ends up in the environment, but in and of itself is actually a lighter weight material that consumes far less resources. So it actually has a better whole of life environmental footprint. We've just got to make sure that it is captured and recycled and kept in the system. But let's not demonize plastic to a point where we end up moving into other packaging materials that consume more energy, consume more water, consume more transport emissions to be able to move them around.
Yeah, see, I tell you what, Tanya, the one piece of new age packaging, if you like, that I really wish they would find a way to improve is paper straws. And those awful wooden knives and forks that you get now. I get why they're doing it, but boy, I wish they could come up with something that was a little bit more user-friendly.
Yeah. And it goes back to your earlier point around, technology, research and development. We're a long way away from knowing what the optimal solution is here. It's a lot like the energy transition where we know we need to move out of fossil fuels, but we're not 100% sure on long-term what is the right energy mix for Australia. Similarly with packaging, we can move out of some materials into others. We can redesign packaging, but, compostable, for example, is seen as that's what we should all be heading for, but yet that has a lot of complexity and can actually cause some unintended consequences around forever chemicals or around contaminating the recycling system. So a lot more research is needed, and this is, again, another role for government to support industry to be able to move quicker, but in a way that doesn't cause unintended consequences for consumer health or for the environment.
I note with interest, Tanya, as we're recording this interview today, I think South Australia is about to move to a ban on the thinner types of plastics. I guess that's the sort of plastics that you would use to package up your vegetables at the supermarket, that type of stuff. So that'll be an interesting experiment, I suppose, to watch on the national stage.
Yeah, I think they're focusing, mostly around like your retail shopping bags rather than your bread bags at this stage. The Food and Grocery Council's been working with major brands of, frozen chips, frozen peas, chocolate, bread, toilet paper, all these products that use a thin plastic film to wrap their product. Now that has a much lower environmental footprint than other types of packaging, but yet it's not widely recyclable. You can't turn a bread bag back into a bread bag because you need new technology that decontaminates it, and that doesn't exist in Australia at the moment. So that means that we need to create a whole new incentive system to encourage the collection and the processing of that soft plastic. I think your listeners will be familiar with the Red Cycle scheme that collapsed with the return to store collection of soft plastic. Now, at its peak, it only collected 4% of soft plastic material. The remaining 96% was going into landfill. So the Food and Grocery Council's been developing a scheme that will collect and process that material. We've now been collaborating with the major supermarkets to bring together a curbside collection scheme and a return to store scheme so that there's a multi-channel option funded by industry for collecting and processing soft plastics back into food-grade soft plastics.
Well, I think all of these issues, it's very much about communication and getting that messaging across. And I think groups such as the Australian Food and Grocery Council and other like-minded organisations play a really vital role in that. So I really congratulate you on that work, and I hope it's ongoing.
Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it.
And Tanya, if people want to know more about the Australian Food and Grocery Council, where would we find you online?
So our website is www.afgc.org.au. We're also on LinkedIn as well. We also have a little series called Sustaining Australia, which is available on LinkedIn, but also on YouTube as well. And there's some short little videos that talk about some of the issues and challenges facing the industry and the innovation that businesses are putting in place to tackle. And they might be climate change related, they might be packaging, but also issues to do with investment and the regional impact of the sector. So anyone interested, look up Sustaining Australia and watch our little videos.
I'll look forward to that. I'll go and have a look right after we finish recording. Tanya Barden, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great.
Thanks, Steve. All the best.
And if you'd like to hear some more on the topics that Tanya's just talked about today, really in even more detail, something I'd think would be of particular interest to anyone who's been listening today who's part of the food manufacturing industry, for example, you can find her on episode number 68 of the Food and Drink Business podcast. That's hosted by the wonderful Kim Berry, and you can find that at foodanddrinkbusiness.com.au or, of course, on your favourite podcatcher. Coming up next, we'll be taking a walk down radio industry memory lane and talking about the art of voiceovers as well with long-time broadcaster and teacher Gary Mack.
You're listening to The Clear Signal.
Welcome back to this second half hour of the show. It's great to have you with us as always. Well, Gary Mack is a name who's well known to many people in the radio world and, for many reasons beyond just his on-air career. It's a journey that began in regional New South Wales in the 1960s at Mudgee and later in Bathurst as well, along with a stint in New Zealand radio before making his way into a long and successful career in the ultra-competitive Melbourne radio scene in the early 1970s. Now, he's also taught countless numbers of radio hopefuls and voiceover artists along the way, and many of those have gone on to very successful careers of their own. Now, Gary's still very active in the radio game these days and in voiceovers, but I've managed to pin him down just for a few moments for a bit of a quick chat about his career and a few other things besides. Gary, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you, mate, and it's good to see your smiling face.
It's good to see you. Now, this is going to be a bit weird, Gary, because you, I mentioned at the top of the show, you're actually one of my mentors in when it comes to doing voiceovers and radio work, and now here I am interviewing you, so it feels a bit weird.
Well, that's a very kind thing to say, Steve. I certainly appreciate that. Look, I guess being a mentor is something that I'm proud to say that I've mentored a few people along the way, because we had the Melbourne Radio School up and running for 20 years, from 84 to 2004. And over that period of time, that short 20 years, a hell of a lot of people got jobs in radio. Not necessarily all on air, but a lot of people got jobs in radio news, a lot of people on air too, but many also got jobs behind the scenes in writing, advertising, copy, getting into audio production. There's really quite a few of them out there still working away. One guy became a manager after a period of time of a radio station in South Australia, and another couple of people managed to get enough money together with the small amount of money they were making in the bush to actually buy some radio stations. And one guy, he runs the breakfast session, I dare say that he's still doing it, on a top FM radio station in Singapore, which is a wonderful story for another time.
That's great reach. It's great reach. It would be interesting to know people's motivations from your experience for getting into radio, but your career stretches back many, many decades, in fact, into the 1960s. What was it that attracted you to radio in the first place?
Oh, I was... You've heard of a band mole. I was a radio groupie as a kid, as a little kid. And my parents had a couple of... my father had a console radio. Now, a console radio is one of those sort of upright things that stands in the corner. It's a piece of furniture, has a big speaker down the bottom, and that you twiddle the dial to get whatever station you wanted up the top. Yeah. So it was a great big piece of furniture. I still have it, actually. I still have it, and it's of sentimental value to me. And I would listen to this radio and wonder how it all happened. Then my father bought probably one of the very first portable radios before transistors. This thing was full of valves and had these huge batteries in it, and you needed 3 people to carry it around.
Geez, good times.
And I built a tree house in the tree at the front of the house that we lived in. And I'd put the radio up there and thought that I was pretty good up there having a radio in my treehouse. But then as I grew older and found out that, radio is something that you do inside a studio with lots of gear and microphones and switches and dials, and that really turned me on. And I met a few people along the way who worked in radio. I tried to give it a try because I'm originally from New Zealand, but I've lost the accent.
Well,
I didn't even have one to
we all have
with,
our crosses to bear, Gary.
So, there you go. But I got to know quite a few people in New Zealand who thought, this guy's got what it takes. I did the audition and failed dismally. So then one day, a friend of mine at a job that I was working at the time said, "Hey, mate, what say we go to Australia for a 6-week working holiday?" And I said, "You're on." And it's been the longest 6 weeks of my life. It's been just beautiful.
That's really interesting, isn't it? I remember when I first stepped into a recording booth, which was actually with you, Gary, at Soundwave Studio in South Melbourne many years ago, and people had said to me the same thing, gee, you've got a voice for radio and possibly a face for radio, who knows? And I thought, really, have I? And then I'd heard you were running a particular course that I want to talk about in a few minutes, and I thought, I'm volunteering for that. And I stepped into the booth and I put the cans on and I listened to myself and I thought, my God, I don't have what it takes at all. This sounds terrible.
Look, we all have... We all have varying degrees of, I don't know, embarrassment. I'm not sure what it is, self-consciousness about our voice. If you record somebody, even if you take a video of someone, you play it back, and they're talking, turn it off, I don't like my voice. And that's a typical human reaction. I'm always taking picky shots at myself when I record stuff in my studio here. And I'm never really ever 100% happy with it. I think if you stand back and say, my word, that's a great voice there, then you're really doing something into the wind. You have to take the voice that you've got and maybe improve on it where you can. It's not rocket science. I know you want to talk about voiceovers in a moment or two, and I've got a couple of tips that I might be able to give those who are listening. But it's just a natural ability to be able to talk, perhaps underwater with a mouthful of marbles is also one of the prerequisites.
Yeah, I hear.
And I guess it's engaging with an audience is what it's about. If you have that engaging personality, then, and if you want to do radio, of course, naturally, you've got to have a burning desire to want to do it. Not everyone will want to do it. You have to have a reasonable reading ability, and you've also got to be fairly punctual with what you do, and you've got to put a bit of effort and work into what you do as well.
I would imagine too, Gary, that radio, in some ways it's changed, I think, in some ways it hasn't. We talk about technology changing, of course, but if I think back to, well, in fact, if you were to think back to times past, maybe in the 60s and 70s, I could imagine guys sitting in studios. I've seen pictures of the Radio Good Guys, for example. I know you were a part of that group. Everyone's in cardigans. They've got nice ties on. I can imagine studios probably, hazy with cigarette smoke and all that sort of stuff. It will be a much more sterile environment these days, but how do you see the industry has changed?
Oh, look, it's changed to the point where okay, I'll throw it out there. I think that there are far too many bloody accountants running radio these days. They're only really interested in how much money did we make today. There have been some in recent times, and it's nothing to do with COVID, although maybe that did have an effect because that also forced a lot of people to work from home, and that changed the paradigm of everything, I suppose. But media outlets generally are suffering from a lack of advertising. There are so many other platforms out there now that advertisers can promote their goods, services, widgets, and products. The incredible margins which gave us almost a license to print money back some time ago now, those days have gone. And there have been a number of redundancies. The radio station industry has also decided that, we need comedians, we need stand-up comedians and footballers to run our radio programs. Now, they may well be good footballers and they may well be good stand-up comedians, but can they, when they sit in a studio without an audience, they need to find that thing that they can engage with an audience. Radio has to become it has to become smarter than it's been. And I think that far too much money is being spent on some individuals. I mean, we have a couple of people pouring into Melbourne radio at the moment who are online from Sydney.
Oh my goodness!
And they're purportedly paid something like $200 million over a period of 10 years. You want to work that out on a daily basis?
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. So how are you going to recoup $200 million over the space of 10 years for just two people who work on your radio station for a couple of hours in the morning? It doesn't make sense to me.
It's a matter of I hear all over the industry. In fact, I've actually noticed this around the world too, that advertising revenue in radio and in television and in print is dwindling and moving in other directions. One of the people I have always admired, and someone that I really followed into broadcasting myself, was an American broadcaster by the name of Leo Laporte. He's based out of San Francisco, a radio guy whose career was supposedly over and actually was a pioneer into the podcast world and started one of the world's really most successful podcast networks. He's actually just recently had to retract that because he's found now that advertising revenue is dwindling in that sphere now. So to sort of paraphrase Leo, radio had 100 years, podcasting's had 10, and we're not really sure what happens next. But it seems to be going, maybe it's going to YouTube.
Well, yeah, you see, there are so many other platforms out there where people can get their entertainment value. And on YouTube, well, you largely get it for free. Sure, you're sometimes bombarded with plenty of ads, but then you can also start paying for it to reduce the number of ads or even wipe them out completely. It's like any other pay-for-view type platform that's out there. You know, Netflix has made an extraordinary inroad with movies, but it all comes back to a question of money. And radio started out as being an entertainment information medium, full stop. And those who worked in it at that time, who started in there, they had a love and a great enjoyment to do that job. Now it's controlled by, how much money did we make today? And if we don't kind of reach that mark, or we don't get that percentage figure that we were hoping for when they do the market research in radio ratings, then you're out the door, fella.
Yeah.
Now, if you're living on a knife edge like that, and they maybe get rid of some people at the radio station because they are not performing, it's not so much the people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes. It's interesting, when I was working in fairly heady conditions in radio where we were competing with each other, we had to meet a certain target. Otherwise, we were on the line. And fortunately for me, I enjoyed some nice ratings along the way. And I never really got myself too involved in what 1.0 percentage might have meant, in a certain cumulative figure. But there were a lot of people who would really worry about the survey results coming out, and they would begin to get sick as a result of all this worry and stress. And I figure, hang on, this is an entertainment medium. And it's kind of continued. I know I'm painting a pretty black picture here, and it's not all like that. No. And I had a damn good ride. I really enjoyed myself. But I look at it today, and you can call me a grumpy old man if you like, but I look at it today and I see people who are on a knife edge, who are really worried. They're in dread that, if someone else gets sacked, that's going to make more work for me. I'm going to get double the load. And that's happening. That's already happening out there. And they're not making as much money as they used to. The pressure from shareholders and owners of radio stations on management and on the performers on the radio station is incredible. Stop it. Yeah. It's just an entertainment medium and communications and information.
I think too, Gary, a lot of people come to me for advice on podcasting and they've got all these ideas about making money. And my advice to them, and I think it probably holds to what you're saying there, is just make good content. Concentrate on making good content and the people will come.
Well, that's a great saying. I mean, that's something that I've admired. That was part of a Kevin Costner movie back in the day about building a baseball paddock out in the middle of nowhere. If you build it, they will come. And that's very true. Radio needs to be more innovative. They're simply trying to make something out of what was great worse, I believe. Explore alternative revenue streams. The key word is to engage. That's what it's about. Because audiences are now being distracted by other platforms, and radio just has to smarten itself up a little bit. If you can make radio into a more visual medium, it's been tried before, many, many times before, but why not do it again?
Yeah, we just have to adapt. We have to learn to adapt.
Yeah.
The Clear Signal.
You're listening to The Clear Signal. I'm speaking with my very special guest, Gary Mack, longtime radio man and a voiceover coach as well. Now, I've had some voiceover coaching from you, Gary, and hopefully it's done me well in over the years. I wanted to talk to you about that because I don't think people really take a lot of notice of the voiceover artists, which sometimes I think might actually be the point, because they don't need to be the star of the show, do they? But it's really a craft. There's really an art to it.
Well, it's been referred to as an acting performance. And yes, you are these days a voice actor. Look, what I say to people is that you've got to, first of all, have a burning desire to want to do this thing, because not everyone, a lot of people think, oh, it's just a voiceover. I could do that. But can you? The thing is, you've got to be persuasive. You've got to have an ability to engage with the person that you're talking to. Advertising these days is not a scattergun approach. It's more being refined or defined to a certain demographic or a certain blue, white collar, young, old, female, male, whatever. And you're talking directly to them. So it's a matter of being able to see that person that you're talking to and just talk to them. And mostly it is just being yourself is the most important thing. There's nothing special about reading a script this way and finding that way to get the words right.
Yeah. No,
otherwise, that sounds a bit hokey as well.
That's what I call going all Bruce Mansfield, I find. And I know that he had a particular style, Bruce, God bless him, but I know when I first started to get into it myself, I looked at, and I did the same when I got into news reading, I looked at people who I like to listen to, and then I tried to emulate that. But you end up trying too hard, I think, don't you? And in the end, as you say, it's a matter of finding your own style and making that work.
Yeah, well, I say to people, look, listen to narrators and voiceover people, but don't try to copy what they do. Listen to their technique. Now, there are one or two people around who have a great ability, and talking about narration, one of them is Sam Neill. He does a lot of narrations. He has this great ability of just speaking very softly. And he has that ability to get the message across. And his emphasis on certain words, his downward inflections, his upward inflections, that then draws a listener in to listen perhaps more intently, as much as there may well be video running at the same time, because we're watching the pictures and we don't really take that much notice of the voiceover, but listen to the style or the technique of the voiceover person. And then apply that when you're reading something from a magazine, a book, whatever, some narrative material, and see whether you're any good at maybe using that style of technique with your voice. And you'll find that when you do, you'll think, yeah, that kind of works. Then you've got to work on it. So it's not just a matter of having a voice to begin with. You've also got to consider the techniques that are required. And you can do that by simply listening to other people that you admire.
One of the other good things we talk about technology too is we're all doing this from home studios now. I do voiceover work from here in my studio. I present this radio show from a home studio. I don't suppose gone are the days where you'd step into a booth in a proper custom-made studio, but boy, there are some opportunities to be able to do this if you've got the knack for it.
Yeah, well, if you have the hankering to do this voiceover thing, one of the advantages, and it is a big advantage, is to have a reasonably well set up studio. Now, you don't have to go out and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, as so many top recording studios in the past have done. It's costly to soundproof or to sound deaden areas, to have a little control room, to go out and buy all the fancy equipment. But you can do it with a laptop computer, a good microphone, an interface between the computer and the microphone that allows you to control levels and plug your headphones into and that sort of thing. And you're kind of up and running. Now, there's any number of YouTube videos out there that you can go and look at. Some of them are in studios that have been sort of a homebrew mix of egg cartons tacked to the wall, old blankets and towels and whatever hanging off this, that, and the other to deaden the sound of the live room. But it works. I know a guy here in Melbourne who pulls a doona over his head to do his voiceovers, and you hear him on radio and on television commercials.
Voiceovers is one thing, but it's really about really getting out there and making public announcements, isn't it? Public speaking. And one of the unique things that you've done in your career is to teach a subsection of society, and I can speak from experience here, who are known to be quite grumpy. You've taught train drivers how to make announcements. Tell us about how that came about.
Yeah, that was interesting how that happened. I had a phone call one day, and it was from someone that I didn't know, and they didn't know me until they fell across my website. And they invited me in to have a chat. That was Connex, actually, when Connex were running the administration of the railway system in this town in Melbourne. And we had a long chat, and I said, yes, I can put something together. And it was on the back of what I was doing with the radio school at that time. And suddenly I was presented with about 10 to maybe 14 train drivers in a room at Southern Cross Railway Station and taught them how to speak proper. But it really did come down to, when you're a train driver, you don't necessarily want to be a radio announcer or an announcement person. And sometimes you have to, because of things that happen and delays, and we have to tell the people what's going on when something happens. And a lot of them were just sort of talking like this. And it was,
Yep.
G'day, mate, there you go, all that sort of stuff. So I said, okay, give the voice a little more volume, because when you give the voice a bit more volume, it gives you a touch of authority.
Yes.
And people will respond to someone who sounds authoritative. And that's just one of the keys, If you're unsure of what you need to say, quickly write it down. If you've got a pen and a piece of paper, and you're able to do that, so long as you don't lose concentration of the job that you're there to do. But even if you just simply make notes, and we used to run down to Soundwave Studio in South Melbourne, throw them in the deep end. And one incredible thing happened. It didn't happen for everyone that went there, but most certainly the majority, they loved it.
Yep.
They thought, this is different. None of them had ever been in a recording studio before. And we gave them the chance of listening to themselves make an announcement in a pro studio.
Yep.
And they all sat back and thought, gee, I can do this. So it's really a question of maybe just giving people some very basic information about slowing down what it is that you want to say. If you speak like a machine gun all the way through, no one's going to hear anything that you have to say.
Yes.
So you slow it down. You make it, you give it some emphasis that we are stopped here for a reason. We'll be on our way, probably 5, maybe 10 minutes time. And, that then satisfies people. But if you don't say anything, or the announcement is a bit rubbishy, or it's too quick, or I don't care if we're going to be here for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
then you will satisfy the crowd that you have on the train. It's like engaging with any audience, Steve.
I think it was a great initiative by that company. I know the company that took over from them ran it for many years too, and I always thought it was a great initiative. And some of us went on and did some more professional training. And in fact, another guest I've had on the show, Gary Hamish Withington, a train driver himself of great repute, has also done training with you. So
yes, he has,
it was a really good thing. Gary, there's so many other things I'd love to talk to you about. Unfortunately, time is against us, but I've really enjoyed having you on the show today. Thank you for everything you've done for all of us in the radio industry, and long may it continue.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Steve. And I've got to say, you said some very kind words about me at the top of all of this. I've admired what you've done and what you are currently doing. I know that you've also been doing a lot of news broadcasting through various platforms to community radio. You're a guy that gets on the spot, you get the story, you're efficient, you get out there, you do it, and you do it in a succinct way. And that's the sort of thing that radio stations should look at. People who can do the job with a great deal of professional ability and then move on to the next job. So I admire what you've been doing, Steve, and thank you for inviting me here. I know I've chewed the leg off an iron pot, but maybe a few edits and you'll make it a bit shorter.
Gary, I really appreciate that. Thanks so much. And, of course, if people want to get some voiceover training, they can go to garymack.com.au and Gary will either do it over Zoom or you can head over to his nice little recording booth down there on the Mornington Peninsula. I could think of much worse places to go and do voiceover training, that's for sure. Well, that's everything we have for you on this week's edition of The Clear Signal, folks. I hope you've enjoyed the show this week. It's been great to have you along. Thanks to Gary Mack for joining us. Thanks also to Tanya Barden for dropping in and telling us all about what's going on in the food and grocery manufacturing sector. I thought that was a fascinating discussion. I hope that gives us all a bit to think about as we head off to the supermarkets for our weekly shop this week. We'll be back next week with more great guests, more great content right here on The Clear Signal. Until then, folks, have a great week, stay safe, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Get in touch. Join the conversation. Find us online at clearsignal.com.au.
Southern Skies Media.